At the mall, a little boy tugs on a billionaire CEO's coat and says, "Hey sir, my mom keeps a photo of you in her office." The man turns around, stunned by what the comment implies. The mall was alive with the kind of energy that only came during the holiday season. Strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed the high ceilings, casting a warm glow over the sea of shoppers. Children laughed as they tugged at their parents' hands, pointing at toy displays and oversized Christmas decorations. The scent of cinnamon and pine mingled with the occasional whiff of sugary treats from the nearby food court. It was a world bustling with joy, but for Jacob Chase, it felt entirely foreign. Jacob adjusted his scarf and glanced at his watch, his brows knitting together. He was not a man who enjoyed the chaos of public spaces, let alone malls at the height of the holiday rush. His assistant had botched the delivery of a gift for a business associate, leaving Jacob with no choice but to venture here himself. The idea of relying on anyone else to fix the problem grated on him. If you wanted something done right, you did it yourself. That philosophy had propelled him to the top of the business world, but it didn't make him any less irritated now. Clutching a sleek black gift bag, Jacob maneuvered through the crowd with the precision of a man accustomed to cutting through obstacles. He ignored the glittering storefronts and cheerful holiday music, focusing solely on the task at hand: get in, deliver the gift, and leave. He was almost at the exit when he felt a small tug at the sleeve of his cashmere coat. Startled, he stopped and looked down to see a boy no older than 6 staring up at him. The boy's bright green eyes were wide with curiosity, and his cheeks were flushed pink from the cold air outside. "Hey, sir," the boy said, his voice light and clear, standing out amid the background hum of shoppers. "My mom keeps a picture of you in her office." Jacob blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He was used to being recognized in business circles or by the occasional magazine reader who'd seen his face on a cover. But this was different. A child? And a picture in an office? He crouched slightly to meet the boy at eye level. "Your mom, huh?" Jacob said, his voice tinged with both curiosity and bemusement. "Are you sure it's me? Maybe you've got me mixed up with someone else." The boy shook his head vigorously. "Nope, it's you. She looks at it all the time. She says you're really smart and super important." The boy paused, as if recalling something specific. "Oh, and she calls you, inspirational." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Inspirational, huh?" The word felt strange, almost foreign, coming from this little boy. Most people described him in much colder terms: driven, relentless, even intimidating. Inspirational wasn't something he'd heard often. Before he could ask anything else, a voice called out from the crowd. "Liam! There you are!" A woman hurried over, her arms laden with shopping bags. Her dark hair framed her face, and there was a hurried but gentle tone to her voice. The boy, Liam, turned and grinned. "Mom, look! It's him! The guy from your picture!" The woman froze for a moment, her eyes landing on Jacob. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by what looked like a mix of embarrassment and surprise. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said quickly, adjusting the bags in her hands. "Liam has a way of getting a little too curious." Jacob straightened and waved a hand dismissively. "No harm done." He glanced at her, noting the faint shadows under her eyes and the way she balanced the weight of the bags with practiced ease. She had the look of someone who carried far more than shopping bags every day. She smiled briefly, the kind of polite smile people offered when they were eager to escape a potentially awkward situation. "Thank you for your patience," she said, gently pulling Liam's hand. "Come on, sweetheart, let's not bother the nice man anymore." "But Mom," Liam started, only to be shushed with a soft but firm "Later, Liam." Jacob watched them walk away, the boy's chatter rising above the noise of the crowd. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he found himself rooted in place, his mind replaying the brief exchange. A picture in her office? He wasn't sure if the idea was flattering, bizarre, or both. What kind of person kept his picture in their office, and why? His curiosity simmered as he turned to leave the mall, but the thought lingered, tapping at the edges of his mind like a persistent question demanding an answer. As he stepped outside into the crisp winter air, the scene replayed in his head. The boy's innocent declaration, the mother's flustered expression, and the words that had struck an unexpected chord. "She says you're inspirational." He wasn't a man who spent much time reflecting on how others saw him. His focus had always been forward, on the next deal, the next project, the next milestone. But now, as he slid into the back seat of his car and gave his driver the address for the gift delivery, he found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. Who was that woman? What was her story? And why did she find him, of all people, inspirational? The city lights blurred into streaks as the car moved through the bustling streets, but Jacob's thoughts remained sharp. The encounter was a puzzle, and for someone like him, puzzles weren't things you left unsolved. Jacob leaned back in his office chair, the city skyline glowing behind him. The encounter at the mall had been hours ago, but his mind kept circling back to the little boy and his bold proclamation. "My mom keeps a picture of you in her office." The words lingered, teasing his curiosity. He wasn't sure why it mattered so much. He'd been in countless offices where his face graced the covers of magazines or newspaper clippings framed on walls. But this felt different. It was personal, intimate even. The woman, Maggie, didn't seem like the type to idolize anyone. Her hurried demeanor and polite dismissal had been genuine, almost self-effacing. Jacob shook his head, annoyed with himself for giving the moment so much thought. He had bigger things to worry about, like finalizing the logistics for a major acquisition. But as he turned to his laptop, ready to dive into the numbers, he could still see the boy's wide green eyes and hear his innocent voice. The next morning, Jacob found himself replaying the memory again. This time, he focused on Maggie's brief appearance. She'd been flustered, but not in a starstruck way. There was a certain dignity to her, even as she juggled shopping bags and wrangled her son. She hadn't fawned over him or tried to hold his attention, which only made the mystery of the picture in her office more intriguing. Later that day, a part of him hoped to simply move on. But fate, or perhaps curiosity, had other plans. He was in a coffee shop near his office, grabbing his usual espresso, when he saw a familiar mop of curly brown hair bouncing through the line. It was Liam, clutching a cup of hot cocoa and wearing a sweater that was a little too big for him. The boy's eyes lit up when he spotted Jacob. "Hey, it's you again!" Liam exclaimed, marching over without hesitation. Jacob couldn't help but smile at the boy's unfiltered enthusiasm. "Hello, Liam," he said, crouching slightly to meet him at eye level. "You're quite the adventurer. Does your mom know you're wandering off again?" "She's right there," Liam said, pointing to the other side of the shop where Maggie stood, engrossed in her phone while waiting for her order. Jacob glanced over and caught a brief glimpse of her, same dark hair, same harried expression. She hadn't noticed him yet. Liam tugged at his sleeve again, drawing his attention back. "I didn't get to tell you yesterday, but my mom works super hard. She always talks about you when she's working." Jacob tilted his head. "Oh? What does she say?" "She says you're really smart and brave because you built your company from nothing. She said you're why she doesn't give up, even when things get hard." Liam took a careful sip of his cocoa, leaving a chocolate mustache on his upper lip. "She looks at your picture when she's tired and says if he can do it, so can I." The boy's words hit Jacob harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being viewed as a source of hope or perseverance. People admired his success, sure, but it was usually accompanied by envy or cynicism. This was different. "And what does your mom do?" Jacob asked. "She makes buildings," Liam said proudly. "She draws them first, though. She says the drawings are like the dreams, and the buildings are what happens when dreams come true." Jacob smiled faintly at the boy's earnestness. "That sounds important." "It is," Liam declared. But just as Jacob was about to ask more, Liam's attention was snagged by the twinkling lights strung around the coffee shop windows. "Whoa! Look at those stars!" he exclaimed, running off to press his nose against the glass. Maggie appeared then, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Jacob crouched near her son. She hurried over, balancing her coffee cup and bag in one hand while reaching for Liam with the other. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly, tugging Liam gently back from the window. "I hope he wasn't bothering you." "Not at all," Jacob said, standing. "We were just chatting." Maggie gave him a quick, apologetic smile, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thank you for being patient with him. He can be very curious." Before Jacob could say more, Liam chimed in. "Mom, I told him about the picture." Maggie froze for a split second, her expression flickering between embarrassment and something Jacob couldn't quite place, vulnerability, perhaps. She looked at him directly then, her gaze steady despite her obvious discomfort. "I'm sure he meant no harm," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you again." She gently took Liam's hand. "Come on, sweetheart, we need to get going." Jacob watched as they left, the little boy happily swinging their joined hands while Maggie kept her eyes forward, avoiding another glance in his direction. The door chimed softly as they exited, leaving Jacob standing there with a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Later that night, as he sat in his high-rise apartment, looking out over the glittering city below, Jacob couldn't shake the image of Maggie and Liam walking away. Her flustered reaction had only deepened the mystery. Why had she chosen to keep his picture? What about his story had resonated with her so deeply that she used it as motivation? He told himself to let it go. After all, it wasn't his business. People drew inspiration from all sorts of places. Maybe Maggie's reasons weren't as personal as they seemed. Yet, no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, Jacob felt a persistent tug, a nagging sense that there was more to this story than met the eye. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Liam's bright smile and heard his innocent words. "If he can do it, so can I." The words lingered, not just in his mind but somewhere deeper, stirring something he hadn't felt in a long time. Restlessness, curiosity, and perhaps just a hint of longing. Jacob sat at his desk, staring at the city skyline as dawn's first light began to filter through his office windows. Sleep had eluded him once again. He'd spent most of the night replaying the encounters with Liam and Maggie in his mind, each detail tugging at him like an unsolved puzzle. His curiosity had turned into a gnawing need for answers. The way Maggie had hurried off both times, her polite smile masking something deeper, lingered in his thoughts. People didn't just keep pictures of someone like him without a reason. Inspiration? Maybe. But there was something else, something unspoken, and Jacob couldn't let it go. He opened his laptop, his fingers hesitating for only a moment before he typed Maggie's name. Maggie and Liam, he thought, though he didn't know the boy's last name. A quick search brought up nothing helpful, so he leaned back, considering his options. If there was one thing Jacob Chase excelled at, it was getting information. With a decisive sigh, he buzzed his assistant, Lauren. "I need you to run a search," he said when she picked up. "Look for a Maggie architect, probably local. She might have applied to Chase Designs at some point." Lauren's pause on the other end told him she wasn't used to such vague instructions. "Do you have a last name?" she asked, her tone professional but mildly skeptical. "No, just start with the applicants from the past few years. Narrow it down to those with promising portfolios. Let me know what you find." The task felt like overkill, even to him, but he rationalized it. If Maggie really had something to do with his company's past, it was worth investigating. He hated loose ends, and this one had wrapped itself tightly around his thoughts. By mid-afternoon, Lauren returned with results. She placed a thin folder on his desk and raised an eyebrow. "Maggie Carter," she said. "She applied for a position here about 3 years ago. Brilliant portfolio, but apparently she never made it past the initial screening. I had to dig into some old emails to figure out why." Jacob flipped open the folder, scanning the attached documents. There was her resume, detailed and polished, along with samples of her work. The designs caught his attention immediately, sleek, innovative, and forward-thinking, yet grounded in practicality. She had a clear vision, the kind of talent his company could have benefited from. "She wasn't hired because of a clerical mistake," Lauren continued. An assistant misfiled her application and marked it incomplete. By the time she followed up, the position had already been filled. Jacob frowned. Mistakes happened, sure, but this one didn't sit right with him. The designs Maggie had submitted were remarkable. If her application had been properly reviewed, she would have been a top contender. He tapped his pen against the desk, frustration mingling with curiosity. "Did she follow up after that?" he asked. Lauren nodded. "She emailed twice to ask for feedback, but I don't think she ever got a response. I'm guessing she moved on." Jacob felt a flicker of guilt, though he knew the oversight hadn't been his fault directly. Still, the idea that someone with such promise had been overlooked because of a bureaucratic error didn't sit well with him. He closed the folder but kept his hand on it, as if holding on to a piece of the puzzle. "Anything else?" he asked. Lauren hesitated. "Not much, but I did find one interesting detail. She's been running her own small firm since then. It's called Carter Studio. Mostly local projects, nothing high profile, but her work has been gaining traction. She's definitely talented." Jacob nodded, absorbing the information. Maggie Carter. An architect with a sharp mind and a relentless drive, who'd been wronged by his company's inefficiency. And yet she still kept a picture of him in her office. The pieces didn't quite add up, and the contradiction only deepened his intrigue. After Lauren left, Jacob sat back, flipping through the portfolio again. Her designs were bold, ambitious, yet somehow personal. He could see how they reflected her as a person, meticulous, thoughtful, unafraid to dream big. He found himself imagining what it would have been like to work with her, to bring her ideas to life on a larger scale. It wasn't just a missed opportunity for her, it was a missed opportunity for him, too. His mind drifted back to Liam's words. "If he can do it, so can I." Maggie had turned what could have been a bitter disappointment into fuel for her own success. That kind of determination was rare. It reminded him of himself in his earlier years, clawing his way to the top with nothing but ambition and grit. He shook his head, trying to refocus. This wasn't just about admiration. It was about understanding why someone like Maggie had chosen to draw inspiration from him despite the obstacles. And, perhaps, it was about making amends for a mistake that had clearly impacted her career. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob had made up his mind. He needed to meet Maggie Carter, to hear her story in her own words. But he also knew he couldn't simply walk into her office and demand answers. That wasn't his style, and it wasn't fair to her. Instead, he decided to take a different approach. He picked up his phone and dialed one of his senior project managers, a man named Gregory who handled partnerships with smaller firms. "I want to arrange a meeting with Carter Studio," Jacob said when Gregory answered. "Set it up as a potential collaboration. I want to hear what they're working on." There was a pause on the other end. "Carter Studio? That's unexpected. They're not exactly on our radar." "They are now," Jacob said firmly. "Make it happen." When the call ended, Jacob leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't entirely sure why this mattered so much to him, but he knew one thing: Maggie Carter had left an impression, and he wasn't one to ignore something, or someone, that intrigued him. As the lights of the city twinkled outside his office, he felt a rare sense of anticipation. This wasn't just about resolving a mystery anymore. It was about connection, about possibility, and maybe, just maybe, about redemption. Jacob stepped out of his car and onto the quiet street where Carter Studio was located. The firm's office was nestled in a modest building, its brick facade adorned with a small, tasteful sign bearing Maggie's name. It was a far cry from the towering glass skyscraper that housed Chase Designs, but there was something inviting about it. Warm, almost personal. Jacob adjusted his coat against the chilly breeze, his breath forming faint clouds as he made his way inside. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, clearly surprised to see someone of his stature. Jacob introduced himself, keeping his tone casual, as if it was perfectly normal for a billionaire CEO to drop by a small architectural firm unannounced. The receptionist quickly buzzed Maggie, her voice a mixture of nerves and excitement. Jacob didn't have to wait long. Maggie appeared from an adjoining office, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying a flicker of surprise. She was dressed professionally, her dark hair pulled back into a loose bun, a pencil tucked behind her ear. For a moment, she seemed caught off guard, but she recovered quickly, offering him a firm handshake. "Mr. Chase," she said, her voice steady. "This is unexpected. Call me Jacob," he replied smoothly, gesturing to the small conference table nearby. "I thought it was time I saw your work in person." Maggie hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly, but she nodded and gestured for him to take a seat. "Of course. I wasn't aware you were considering smaller firms for partnerships, but I appreciate the opportunity." Jacob smiled faintly, impressed by her composure. If she was thrown by his sudden appearance, she wasn't showing it. She sat across from him, pulling a portfolio from the table and laying it out between them. "I assume you've seen some of my designs already," she began, flipping through the pages. "But these are a few recent projects I've been working on. They're smaller scale, but I believe they demonstrate the kind of innovation your company values." Jacob listened as she spoke, noting the passion in her voice as she explained each project. Her work was even more impressive in person. Clean lines, thoughtful integration with the environment, and a sense of purpose behind every design. It was clear she poured herself into her creations. "You've got an incredible eye for detail," Jacob said when she paused. "I can see why your portfolio caught my attention." Maggie smiled politely, but there was a guardedness in her expression. "Thank you. I'll admit, I was surprised when your office reached out. I wasn't sure Chase Designs would be interested in a firm like mine." Jacob leaned back slightly, studying her. "Why not? Talent is talent, regardless of the scale." Maggie tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Not everyone in your position sees it that way." Jacob caught the edge in her tone, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't bitterness exactly, but there was something unspoken behind her words. He decided to address it directly. "I owe you an apology," he said, surprising even himself. Maggie looked at him, her expression briefly flickering with confusion. 3 years ago, you applied for a position at Chase Designs. Your application was mishandled, and I believe we missed out on someone with incredible potential." Maggie blinked, her professional demeanor faltering for a moment. I didn't realize you knew about that." "I only found out recently," Jacob admitted. "I looked into it because I wanted to understand why someone like you, who clearly has the talent, didn't end up working with us." Maggie exhaled softly, her gaze dropping to the portfolio in front of her. "It was disappointing at the time, but I've made peace with it. Starting my own firm was the better path for me, even if it wasn't easy." Her words were honest but not resentful, and Jacob felt a flicker of respect for her resilience. She hadn't let the setback define her. Instead, she'd carved out her own space, built something from the ground up. It was a quality he admired deeply. "You've done well for yourself," Jacob said, his tone warm. "And I'm impressed." "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice softer now. "That means a lot coming from you." Jacob hesitated, then decided to ask the question that had been on his mind since their first encounter. "There's one thing I've been wondering," he began, his tone shifting slightly. "Liam mentioned something the other day, about a picture of me in your office." Maggie stiffened slightly, her eyes widening for a brief moment before she caught herself. "Oh," she said, glancing away as a faint blush crept up her cheeks. "I suppose he would mention that." Jacob leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Why do you have it?" Maggie hesitated, as if weighing how much to share. Finally, she sighed and met his gaze, her expression sincere. "It's not what you think," she said. "I don't idolize you or anything like that." Jacob chuckled softly. "Good to know. It's a reminder," she continued, her voice steady but quieter now, "of what's possible. You've built something extraordinary from nothing, and that's not easy. Especially not in this industry." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the portfolio absent-mindedly. "When things get tough, and they often do, I look at that picture and remind myself that success is achievable, even when the odds feel stacked against me. Jacob was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. It wasn't flattery or hero worship, it was something deeper. She'd found inspiration in his story, not him as a person but what he represented. And that, somehow, felt more meaningful. I didn't realize I could have that kind of impact, he said finally, his voice thoughtful. Maggie smiled faintly. You'd be surprised how far a little hope can go. The conversation lingered in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Jacob found himself feeling something he hadn't expected, humility. For all his accomplishments, he'd rarely stopped to think about how his journey might resonate with others. Maggie Carter, with her quiet strength and unshakable determination, had given him a new perspective. As their meeting wrapped up, Jacob stood and offered her his hand. Thank you for your time, Maggie. I'll be in touch about the partnership. Maggie shook his hand, her grip firm. Thank you for the opportunity. As he walked out of Carter's studio, Jacob felt a rare sense of clarity. He'd come here to satisfy his curiosity, but he was leaving with something more, a connection to a woman whose story, like his own, was one of perseverance and possibility. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd gained something invaluable, perspective. Jacob found himself back at his office, staring out at the skyline but feeling strangely unsettled. His visit to Carter's studio had given him plenty to think about. Maggie's quiet resilience, her ability to carve out her own path despite setbacks, lingered in his mind. And then there was her confession about the picture, a reminder of what was possible. It had been honest, unembellished, and somehow more impactful than any praise he'd received in his career. He didn't often dwell on the human element of his success. To him, his accomplishments were the result of strategy, determination, and relentless effort. But Maggie had seen something more, something he hadn't even considered: hope. It wasn't a word Jacob used often, but he couldn't deny the weight of it now. A few days later, Jacob arranged another meeting. He told himself it was about solidifying the partnership, ensuring the logistics aligned with his vision. But deep down, he knew he wanted to know more about Maggie, her journey, her struggles, and what had brought her to this point. There was something about her story that felt unfinished, and he couldn't let it go. When Maggie arrived at Chase Designs, she carried herself with the same quiet confidence he'd noticed before. She looked slightly out of place among the gleaming glass walls and tailored suits, but her presence had a grounding quality that Jacob found refreshing. "Thank you for coming," Jacob said, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Of course," Maggie replied, settling in. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting a follow-up so soon." Jacob smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "I wanted to hear more about your story. You've been open about finding inspiration in my journey, but I'm curious about yours. How did you end up where you are now?" Maggie hesitated, her hands resting lightly in her lap. "It's not exactly a glamorous tale," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "Those are usually the best kind," Jacob replied, his tone encouraging. Maggie exhaled softly, her gaze briefly drifting to the skyline before returning to Jacob. "Well, I've always loved architecture. Even as a kid, I'd sketch buildings in the margins of my notebooks. But pursuing that dream wasn't easy. I grew up in a small town, and opportunities were limited, to say the least." She paused, her expression softening. "When I got into architecture school, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. But then, life threw me a curveball. I found out I was pregnant with Liam during my final year." Jacob's brows lifted slightly, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "I was scared," Maggie admitted. "Not just because I was going to be a single mom, but because I didn't want to give up on my dreams. I worked odd jobs, took on freelance design gigs, anything to make ends meet while finishing school. It wasn't easy, but Liam gave me a reason to keep going. He became my motivation." Jacob leaned forward slightly, his attention fully on her. "And after school? I landed a few entry-level jobs, but breaking into the industry was tough. Architecture is competitive, and being a single mom didn't exactly make me a prime candidate. Employers didn't always say it outright, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't think I could handle the demands. Her voice was steady, but Jacob caught the faintest hint of frustration beneath the surface. So, when I applied to Chase Designs, I thought it was my big chance. I poured everything into that application, my best work, my clearest vision. When I didn't hear back, it was hard. I started to question if I was good enough. Jacob felt a pang of guilt, even though he knew the oversight hadn't been his doing. "I'm sorry that happened," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Maggie nodded, offering a faint smile. "Thank you." But in a way, it pushed me to start Carter Studio. I realized I couldn't wait for someone else to give me a chance. If I wanted to succeed, I had to create my own opportunities. Jacob regarded her for a moment, impressed by her determination. "And you did. Your work speaks for itself." "Thank you," Maggie said again, her smile more genuine this time. "But it hasn't been easy. There were nights when I wondered if I'd made the wrong choice. Times when I felt like I was failing Liam because I couldn't give him everything I wanted to. But then I'd look at that picture of you on my desk, and I'd remember why I started." Jacob raised an eyebrow, the corners of his mouth quirking up. "You keep making me sound much more inspiring than I deserve." Maggie laughed softly. "It's not about you exactly. It's about what you represent. You built something incredible from nothing. And if you could do it, why couldn't I?" Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jacob felt something he rarely experienced: humility. He'd always viewed his journey as a series of calculated moves, each step driven by logic and ambition. But Maggie saw it differently. To her, his success was proof that the impossible could become possible. "I don't think I've ever thought of myself that way," Jacob admitted. "I've always been focused on the next goal, the next challenge." Hearing this, "It's humbling." Maggie smiled, her gaze steady. "Well, I guess we both see things differently now." Jacob nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Your story is incredible, Maggie. It's a testament to your resilience and talent. And I'm glad I got the chance to hear it." "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "It means a lot to hear that from someone like you." As their conversation wound down, Jacob felt a sense of clarity. Maggie Carter wasn't just an architect or a potential business partner. She was a person who had faced immense challenges and risen above them with grace and determination. Her story reminded him that success wasn't just about numbers or accolades, it was about perseverance, growth, and the ability to inspire others. When Maggie left his office, Jacob sat for a while, staring at the skyline. He'd come into this meeting expecting to learn more about her, but he'd ended up learning something about himself. For the first time in years, he felt like his work, his journey, had a purpose beyond his own ambitions. And it was a feeling he wasn't ready to let go of. Jacob spent the weekend reflecting on his conversation with Maggie. Her story had struck a chord, reminding him of his own early struggles, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. He admired her resilience, her quiet determination, and the way she spoke about her son with such pride and love. It was clear Maggie wasn't just talented, she was extraordinary. By Monday morning, Jacob had made up his mind. He wasn't content to let Maggie's story end where it had. There was unfinished business between them, and he saw an opportunity to set things right, not as an act of charity, but because he believed in her potential. When Maggie walked into his office later that day, she looked more confident than before, though there was still a hint of wariness in her eyes. She sat across from him, her posture poised but guarded. "Thank you for coming in again," Jacob began, his tone warm but professional. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversations, and I wanted to propose something." Maggie tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering across her face. "Go on." Jacob leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "I'd like you to pitch your architectural ideas to my team. We have a few upcoming projects where I think your perspective could make a real impact." Maggie blinked, clearly surprised. "You want me to pitch to Chase Designs?" "Yes," Jacob said without hesitation. You've proven that you have a unique vision. I think it's time you had the chance to show it to a broader audience. Maggie hesitated, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. I don't know, she said slowly. I appreciate the opportunity, but I need to know this isn't about making up for the past. I don't want to be handed something because you feel guilty about what happened 3 years ago. Jacob nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I respect that, Maggie. And let me be clear, this isn't about guilt. I'm offering you this chance because I genuinely believe in your talent. My team won't go easy on you, and neither will I. This is a fair shot, nothing more. Maggie studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. Okay, she said. I'll do it. But only if you promise to treat me like any other candidate. Deal, Jacob said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I wouldn't expect anything less. They spent the next hour discussing the logistics of the pitch. Jacob outlined the scope of the projects, while Maggie asked thoughtful, pointed questions that made it clear she was already thinking several steps ahead. By the time she left, Jacob felt a renewed sense of excitement. He hadn't been this eager about a project, or a person, in a long time. Over the following weeks, Jacob found himself crossing paths with Maggie more often, sometimes at his office, other times at Carter's studio. Each interaction deepened his admiration for her, but it was Liam who truly caught him off guard. One afternoon, as Jacob dropped off some blueprints for Maggie, Liam burst into the room like a whirlwind of energy. He wore a superhero cape and carried a plastic sword, his cheeks flushed from playing outside. Mr. Jacob! Liam exclaimed, running up to him. Did you bring more boring papers for Mom? Jacob chuckled, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. They're not boring. They're plans for your mom's next big idea. Liam squinted at the blueprints, clearly unimpressed. They just look like squiggly lines to me. Well, Jacob said with a conspiratorial smile, those squiggly lines are going to turn into something amazing. But it takes someone as smart as your mom to make it happen. Liam grinned, clearly delighted by the compliment. Mom's super smart. She even knows how to fix my Lego towers when they fall down. Jacob laughed, genuinely charmed by the boy's unfiltered enthusiasm. He spent the next few minutes listening to Liam's stories, marveling at how easily the boy's joy and curiosity filled the room. When Maggie returned from a phone call, she paused in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. There was a softness in her expression, a quiet appreciation for the way Jacob interacted with her son. Liam, she said gently, I'm sure Mr. Chase has a lot of work to do. Let's not keep him too long. But we were talking about buildings. Liam protested, looking up at Jacob. He's fun. Can he stay? Jacob met Maggie's gaze, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. I don't mind. Maggie shook her head, laughing softly. You're going to spoil him. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob found himself spending more time with Liam, both at the studio and during casual visits. The boy's boundless energy and honesty were a refreshing contrast to the polished facades Jacob was used to in his world. Liam spoke his mind without hesitation, often blurting out things that made Jacob laugh, or think. One evening, as they sat at Maggie's kitchen table reviewing design sketches, Liam climbed onto Jacob's lap, holding a crayon. You and Mom should work together all the time, Liam announced, scribbling on a scrap piece of paper. You make a good team. Maggie, who was pouring coffee at the counter, turned and raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Uh-huh, Liam said confidently. You're both super smart. And you laugh more when he's here. Jacob glanced at Maggie, catching the faint blush that crept into her cheeks. She quickly looked away, focusing on the coffee mugs in her hands. Well, Jacob said, ruffling Liam's hair, your mom is the real genius. I'm just here to keep up. Liam grinned, clearly satisfied with the answer. Jacob couldn't help but feel a warm sense of belonging in that moment, as if he'd stumbled into something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Later that night, as he drove home, Jacob reflected on how much his life had shifted since meeting Maggie and Liam. They brought a sense of purpose and connection that he hadn't felt in years. And while he couldn't predict where this journey would lead, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't ready to let go. Jacob arrived at the conference room early, a rarity for him. The team was already preparing for the pitch, spreading out blueprints, setting up the projector, and adjusting the lighting to give Maggie's presentation the attention it deserved. He scanned the room, noting the mixture of anticipation and skepticism among his senior executives. These were seasoned professionals, accustomed to cutting-edge proposals from established firms. Maggie, with her small studio and unconventional path, would have to fight for their respect. As Maggie entered the room, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her dark hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore a tailored blazer that spoke of professionalism without pretense. She met Jacob's gaze briefly, and he gave her a small nod of encouragement. He'd seen her passion firsthand, but he knew this room wouldn't make it easy for her. Still, Maggie didn't flinch. "Good morning, everyone," Maggie began, her voice steady as she stood at the head of the table. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my vision." She started her pitch, her designs projected onto the large screen behind her. Each slide was a testament to her creativity and thoughtfulness, sleek structures that blended form and function, integrated with natural landscapes in ways that were both innovative and practical. Maggie spoke with precision and clarity, detailing her approach to sustainable materials and adaptive architecture, capturing the room's attention despite their initial reservations. As she moved through her presentation, Jacob noticed subtle shifts among the executives. A few leaned forward, intrigued, while others exchanged skeptical glances. He could almost hear their internal debates. Could someone with such limited large-scale experience handle a project of this magnitude? Was she the right choice? When Maggie finished, there was a moment of silence before the questions started. At first, they were professional and technical, queries about materials, cost projections, and timelines. Maggie fielded each one with poise, her knowledge and preparation shining through. But then, the tone shifted. One executive, a sharp-faced man named Douglas, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Ms. Carter, your designs are undeniably creative, but this project isn't just about innovation. It's about scale, complexity, and the ability to deliver under pressure. You've done excellent work in smaller settings, but can you really handle something of this size?" Maggie hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a ripple of doubt through the room. Jacob's jaw tightened. He had anticipated resistance, but seeing it play out was another matter. Maggie met Douglas's gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I understand your concerns, and I won't pretend this isn't a leap from my previous projects. But I believe every architect, no matter how experienced, faces their first major challenge at some point. I've built my career on solving problems and exceeding expectations, and I'm confident I can do the same here." Douglas frowned, clearly unconvinced, and murmurs spread through the room. Jacob knew this was his moment to step in. He straightened in his chair, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Douglas," Jacob said, his tone measured but commanding, "every great talent starts somewhere. I see in Maggie the same qualities that built this company: innovation, determination, and an unwillingness to back down from a challenge. If we dismiss her based solely on scale, we risk losing something extraordinary." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Jacob. He rarely intervened in these discussions, preferring to let his team debate freely. But today was different. Today, he was staking his credibility on Maggie's potential. "Her designs aren't just creative, they're forward-thinking and practical," Jacob continued. "I've seen her process firsthand. She doesn't just plan buildings, she builds visions that adapt to the needs of the future. That's exactly the kind of thinking this company needs." Maggie glanced at Jacob, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. For the first time, she realized his support wasn't about making amends or fulfilling an obligation. He genuinely believed in her talent. The murmurs died down, replaced by thoughtful silence. Douglas looked unconvinced but said nothing further. One by one, the other executives nodded their agreement, recognizing the weight of Jacob's endorsement. After the meeting, as the room emptied, Maggie lingered near the projector, rolling up her blueprints with deliberate care. Jacob approached, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. "You handled yourself well," he said, his voice warm. Maggie smiled faintly, glancing up at him. "Thank you. I wasn't sure I'd get through to them." "You did," Jacob replied. "And for what it's worth, you would have had my vote no matter what they decided." Maggie paused, her fingers brushing the edge of a blueprint. "I meant what I said in there. I know this is a big leap for me. But I also know I can do it." "I don't doubt that," Jacob said. "And neither will they, once they see what you're capable of." She nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "It means a lot, having you in my corner." For Jacob, the moment felt significant in ways he hadn't anticipated. Supporting Maggie had been the right thing to do, but it also marked a shift in his perspective. He wasn't just an executive chasing the next milestone, he was a leader with the power to elevate others. It was a role he hadn't fully embraced until now, and it felt different, purposeful. Later that evening, Jacob returned to his penthouse apartment, the city lights sprawling beneath him like a sea of possibility. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting on the day. Maggie's courage, her refusal to back down even when challenged, had left an impression on him. She reminded him of himself in his early years, brimming with ideas but constantly fighting to prove his worth. Yet there was a softness to Maggie, a quiet strength that balanced her ambition. And Liam, with his unfiltered honesty and boundless energy, had brought something into Jacob's life that he hadn't even realized he was missing: connection. As he sipped his wine, Jacob allowed himself to imagine what might come next. Not just for Maggie and her career, but for himself. For years, he had pursued success relentlessly, sacrificing relationships and personal fulfillment along the way. But Maggie and Liam had shown him that there was more to life than ambition. There was meaning in building bridges, in creating something greater than oneself. And for the first time in years, Jacob felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost: hope. Jacob leaned back in his chair, watching the room as the applause broke out. Maggie stood at the front of the conference room, her face a mixture of pride and disbelief as the board members congratulated her on the approval of her designs. She had done it. Her vision for the urban redevelopment project had not only been greenlit but had sparked genuine excitement among the company's decision-makers. It was a moment of validation, the culmination of weeks of preparation and years of perseverance. Jacob caught her eye from across the room, and she smiled, a private, unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had led them to this point. He gave her a small nod, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and something more personal, something he wasn't quite ready to name. When the meeting ended, Maggie approached Jacob as the other executives filtered out. She clutched her portfolio, her knuckles white against the leather. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I couldn't have done this without your support." Jacob shook his head. "You did this, Maggie. I just gave you the opportunity." She smiled, a little more at ease now. "Well, either way, I'm grateful." They left the conference room together, walking through the sleek corridors of Chase Designs. Jacob could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken shift in their dynamic. This wasn't just about business anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Over the following months, Maggie's partnership with Chase Designs flourished. Her firm, Carter Studio, remained independent, but her collaboration with Jacob's team brought her work into the spotlight. The urban redevelopment project became a cornerstone of her portfolio, drawing attention from other major clients and cementing her reputation as a rising star in the field. Despite the growing demands of her career, Maggie remained grounded, balancing her newfound success with her responsibilities as a mother. Jacob marveled at how seamlessly she managed it all, and as their professional relationship deepened, so did their personal connection. Jacob began spending more time with Maggie and Liam, often under the guise of project meetings or casual dinners. But the lines between work and personal life blurred, and Jacob found himself drawn into their world in ways he hadn't anticipated. Liam's boundless energy and infectious laughter became a highlight of his days, and Maggie's quiet strength and warmth brought a sense of calm he hadn't realized he needed. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Jacob found himself at Maggie's home. They had ordered takeout, and Liam had insisted on a movie night. Jacob sat on the couch, Liam nestled beside him with a bowl of popcorn. Maggie sat on the other side, her legs tucked under her, as she watched the screen. Jacob glanced at her, taking in the way her face softened in the glow of the television. She caught him looking and smiled, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. He returned the smile, feeling a warmth he couldn't quite explain. Later, as Liam dozed off, his head resting on Jacob's arm, Maggie carefully lifted him and carried him to his room. When she returned, Jacob was still sitting on the couch, the soft hum of the television filling the silence. "Sorry about that," she said, sitting back down. "He'll use any excuse to stay up late." "I don't mind," Jacob said. "He's a great kid." Maggie smiled, her gaze lingering on him. "He's taken a real liking to you. I think you've become his favorite person." Jacob chuckled, his voice low. "The feeling's mutual." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the day fading away. Then Maggie spoke, her voice quiet but earnest. "I don't think I've ever said this, but having you in our lives has been unexpected in the best way. I didn't realize how much I needed someone like you." Jacob's chest tightened, her words stirring something deep within him. He reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. "You've changed my life too, Maggie. More than I ever thought possible." Their eyes met, the unspoken emotions between them palpable. But before either of them could say more, the moment passed, and Maggie gently pulled her hand away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. As their partnership continued, Jacob couldn't ignore the growing feelings he had for Maggie. They lingered in the quiet moments, shared glances, fleeting touches, the way her laughter seemed to light up a room. He had built his life around ambition and success, but Maggie and Liam had shown him something he hadn't realized he was missing: connection, family, and the possibility of love. The urban redevelopment project eventually reached its groundbreaking ceremony, a milestone that marked a new chapter for both Maggie and Chase Designs. As the event concluded, Maggie stood beside Jacob, her face glowing with pride as she surveyed the crowd. "You did it," Jacob said, his voice filled with admiration. "We did it," Maggie corrected, her eyes meeting his. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jacob wanted to say more, to tell her how much she meant to him, but the moment wasn't right. Instead, he simply smiled, knowing the time would come. A few weeks later, Jacob visited Maggie's office for the first time since their partnership began. Liam greeted him at the door, pulling him inside with his usual enthusiasm. "Come see what Mom did!" Liam exclaimed, dragging him toward her desk. Jacob followed, his gaze landing on the wall behind Maggie's workspace. There, framed neatly, was the picture Liam had mentioned all those months ago, a magazine cover featuring Jacob, his expression stoic and confident. But now, it wasn't alone. Beside it hung a new photo, one that made Jacob pause. It was a candid shot of the three of them, Maggie, Liam, and Jacob, taken at the groundbreaking ceremony. They were smiling, their arms around each other, the joy and connection in their faces undeniable. Liam beamed. "I told Mom this one's my favorite." Jacob turned to Maggie, his heart swelling as he saw the warmth in her eyes. She shrugged lightly, a shy smile playing at her lips. "I thought it was time for an update," she said. Jacob chuckled, his voice soft. "It's perfect." As he stood there, surrounded by Maggie's work and the life she had built, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. For so long, his life had been about the next goal, the next success. But now, with Maggie and Liam, he realized there was so much more to strive for. And for the first time in his life, Jacob felt like he was truly home. The Chase Designs Holiday Gala was an event of grandeur, held in a sleek downtown venue with high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the snow-dusted city. Guests in formal attire filled the room, their laughter mingling with the soft notes of a live jazz band. Jacob stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd with a rare mix of anticipation and nerves. He'd invited Maggie and Liam tonight, wanting to share this part of his world with them. When they arrived, Jacob's breath caught. Maggie wore a deep emerald dress that complemented her dark hair, and Liam, dressed in a tiny suit and bow tie, looked equally polished and utterly adorable. Maggie's smile was warm but slightly hesitant as she approached, Liam clutching her hand. "You both look incredible," Jacob said, his voice genuine. "Liam, you might just be the best-dressed person here." Liam beamed. "I picked the bow tie myself." Maggie chuckled, her eyes meeting Jacob's. "Thank you for inviting us. This is impressive." "I'm glad you're here," Jacob said, his tone softer as he led them into the room. Throughout the evening, Jacob found himself gravitating toward them. He introduced Maggie to a few of his colleagues, who were quick to compliment her recent project. Liam, meanwhile, charmed everyone he met, basking in the attention but always circling back to Jacob's side. As the night wore on, Jacob felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Amid the laughter and clinking glasses, he noticed Maggie slipping out onto the balcony, the cool winter air drawing her away from the bustling crowd. He followed, his shoes crunching lightly against the thin layer of snow that had settled on the balcony floor. Maggie leaned against the railing, her breath visible in the frosty air. The city lights stretched out below them, a sea of glittering gold and silver. She turned when she heard him approach, her expression softening. "Needed a break?" Jacob asked, stepping beside her. Maggie nodded. "It's beautiful in there, but a little overwhelming. Out here, it's quieter." Jacob chuckled. "I know the feeling." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party muffled by the glass doors behind them. The snow fell gently, flakes catching in Maggie's hair, and Jacob felt the words rising in his chest before he could stop them. "Maggie," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What is it?" Jacob exhaled, his breath clouding in the cold air. "You and Liam, you've changed me. Before I met you, my life was all about work, goals, achievements, the next big deal. But since you came into my life, I've started to see things differently." Maggie's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "You've reminded me what it means to feel connected, to care about something beyond the next milestone. And Liam, he's shown me a kind of joy I didn't even know I was missing." Maggie's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Jacob, I feel the same way. You've become such an important part of our lives." But, Jacob prompted gently. She turned back to the railing, her fingers brushing the frosty metal. "I'm scared. My life with Liam is complicated. I've worked so hard to build something stable for him, and the thought of changing that, blending our lives, it's a lot to consider." Jacob stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "I understand, Maggie. And I don't want to do anything that disrupts the life you've created. But I also know that what we could have, is worth taking a chance on." Maggie looked at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "It's not just about me. It's about Liam. He's been through so much already. I can't risk him getting hurt." Jacob reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I would never do anything to hurt him. Or you. I don't take this lightly, Maggie. I care about both of you more than I can put into words." He paused, a memory surfacing as he searched for the right words. "When I was a kid, my mom used to tell me that the most important thing you can build isn't a skyscraper or a company, it's a life you're proud of. For a long time, I thought that meant success, wealth, all the things I've worked for. But now I see it differently. A life worth building is one that's shared, with the people who matter most." Maggie's breath hitched, her expression softening as she looked at him. The snow fell around them, the city lights painting the moment in a golden glow. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, his hand still holding hers. I'm not asking for all the answers tonight. I just want to know if you're willing to try. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Maggie's gaze locked with his, and the weight of her hesitation melted into something lighter, something hopeful. Yes, she said softly. I'm willing to try. Jacob's heart swelled, and before he could second-guess himself, he leaned in. Maggie met him halfway, their lips brushing in a kiss that was both tentative and full of unspoken promises. The world seemed to fade, leaving only the warmth between them and the gentle snowfall around them. The sound of glass tapping against the door broke the moment. They turned to see Liam standing on the other side, his face pressed against the glass, grinning from ear to ear. He opened the door and bounded out onto the balcony, heedless of the cold. I knew it! Liam exclaimed, his voice bright with excitement. I told you you'd make a great team! Maggie laughed, scooping Liam into her arms. Jacob smiled, his heart full as he reached out to ruffle Liam's hair. We'll see about that, Maggie said, her voice teasing but warm. Jacob met her gaze, his expression filled with quiet certainty. I think he might be onto something. As they stepped back inside, the warmth of the party enveloping them once more, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet, unshakable belief that he was exactly where he was meant to be. This wasn't just the start of a new chapter, it was the beginning of a life he was truly proud to build together. As the snow continues to fall gently outside, Jacob, Maggie, and Liam step into a future filled with promise, connection, and the courage to take chances. Their journey reminds us that sometimes, the greatest risks lead to the most rewarding outcomes, and that life's most beautiful moments are often found in the bonds we build with others. If you enjoyed this story of love, resilience, and finding purpose, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales. Let us know in the comments, what's a moment in your life when taking a leap of faith led to something extraordinary? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.